Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The first time I saw the town, it looked like somebody had turned the sound off. No traffic, no barking dogs, no music leaking through open windows. Just wind dragging dry leaves in lazy circles across the main street, and a few paper signs still taped to storefront glass like they mattered. Closed until further notice, back in 15, call before entering. I had learned the hard way that quiet didn't always mean safe. Quiet could mean everyone left in a hurry. Quiet could mean everyone stayed and didn't. But quiet was also what I needed. My name is Caleb Mercer. Before everything went sideways, I was a building inspector for Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, and a part-time volunteer with a local emergency management team. It wasn't an exciting job. I crawled through basements, checked fire doors, argued about exit signage, and wrote reports nobody read unless they were forced to. When the outbreak hit and the world started running on rumors and instinct, that boring background became the one thing I could still use like a tool. I didn't have a crew. I didn't have a convoy, or a big plan, or a radio network with call signs. I had a dented pickup with a full-size spare, a map book that was missing the cover, a case of bottled water rolling around on the floorboards, and a routine that kept me alive. Move early, stay out of sight, never push my luck for one more can. That routine brought me to Lichens. If you've never been, it's a small borough tucked up in the hills north of Harrisburg, the kind of place where you can tell you're close before you see the sign because the road's narrow and the trees lean in. There's a main street with brick buildings, a few churches, a diner that used to do breakfast all day, and neighborhoods climbing up the slopes like they were built one porch at a time. Coal country edges, old rail town bones. In normal times, it felt like a place you'd pass through without noticing. Now, it was nearly empty. Nearly. I parked 2 blocks off the main street behind a row of garages, engine off, and just sat there with my hands on the wheel until my breathing slowed down. The air smelled like cold wood and old asphalt. December in Pennsylvania had a way of keeping everything sharp. On the passenger seat was my checklist, not written on paper anymore, but burned into my head. I ran it anyway because that's what you do when everything else is unpredictable. Listen first, watch second, move third. I cracked the door open an inch and let it rest against the latch so it couldn't swing. No sudden squeal from hinges. No barking from a dog that had been waiting behind the fence. No human voice calling out a "hey!" Just wind. I slid out with my pack, closed the door carefully, and did the slow scan up and down the street from the cover of the garages. The sky was overcast, the color of unwashed wool. The light was flat, which was bad for shadows but good for not being seen. My rifle was slung but not raised. A rifle is a comfort until it makes you sloppy. Sloppy gets you cornered. Cornered gets you ended. I'd learned to travel like a utility worker, not like a movie hero. High visibility mindset without the vest. Keep your head down, don't announce yourself, and if you have to touch a door, touch it like it might bite. The stores along Main Street were mostly locked. A few had broken glass and footprints in the dust, the kind of footprints that told you someone had gone in with urgency and come out without time to clean up. A pharmacy sign was still hanging, slightly crooked. The window had a hand-painted message, "No more oxygen tanks." Oxygen tanks meant a clinic, a nursing home, or someone who needed help even before this all started. I kept moving. I wasn't there for shopping, like it was a normal day. I wasn't there to fill a cart. I was there for the stuff that mattered now, sealed food, medical basics, batteries, fuel stabilizer if I got lucky, and anything that could keep me warm without lighting up the whole town like a beacon. The trick was to find what everyone else missed. I cut behind buildings, staying off the open street when I could, using alleys and backlots and the soft ground behind fences. When I crossed open areas, I crossed fast and low, like I was late for an appointment. By late morning, I had picked through a hardware store enough to add a few useful things without making a mess. A small roll of duct tape, a box of screws, a new pry bar that felt like a luxury, and a pair of leather work gloves that didn't have holes in the fingertips. I left everything else. You can't carry a store on your back. You can only carry what you'll actually use. I was about to head back toward the truck when I saw the sign. It wasn't bright. It wasn't new. It was faded and dirty and half covered by a poster for a high school fundraiser from years ago. But the shape was unmistakable. A black and yellow Civil Defense Fallout Shelter sign. I stopped so fast my boots scuffed the pavement. There are some symbols that get into your bones if you've worked around public buildings long enough. Fire exit arrows. No smoking. AED signs. And if you've ever had to inspect an old municipal building in the Northeast, those fallout shelter signs, left over from a time when people thought a painted marker and some canned crackers could stand between them and the end of the world. I walked closer, slow, heart beating a little harder. The sign was bolted to the brick beside a narrow set of basement steps leading down under what looked like an old insurance office, or maybe a former bank. The storefront windows were dusty, blinds half drawn. Above the door was a cracked transom with peeling gold letters I could barely read. Lycan's Savings Loan, it said, like it still believed that meant something. The basement door was metal, painted gray, with a simple handle and a key cylinder. Nothing fancy, but the steps leading down were sheltered by a concrete overhang, and the doorway itself was set back deep enough that you couldn't see it from the street unless you were looking. My eyes moved automatically to the corners, the shadows under the overhang, the places something could be waiting. Nothing moved. I took 2 steps down, then stopped and listened again. The town's quiet pressed in around me. My breath sounded too loud. The idea hit me all at once. If this really was a shelter, it might have been sealed. Not looted, not picked clean, not raided by desperate hands in the first few days when everyone still thought help was coming. A place forgotten is sometimes a place untouched, or a place where someone went and never came back out. I didn't rush it. I pulled my small mirror from my jacket pocket, an inspection mirror with a telescoping handle, the kind you use to see behind a pipe or check a label in a tight spot. I slid it down toward the bottom of the door and angled it, checking the gap in the ground inside. Dust, concrete. No obvious debris pile, no movement. Next, air. People laugh about checking air until they've been in a basement where a gas water heater backdrafted, or a storage room where something leaked and nobody knew. The world used to have safety departments for this stuff. Now, it had me. I unclipped the multi-gas detector from my pack strap. A little black box with a screen, scarred from use. It could read oxygen percentage, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and combustible gas levels. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than guessing. I held it near the door seam and waited for the numbers to stabilize. Nothing alarming. Oxygen normal, no spike in carbon monoxide, no combustible gas reading. That didn't mean everything was safe, but it meant I wasn't stepping into an invisible problem that would drop me in 30 seconds. I set the detector on my wrist lanyard, pulled on the new gloves, and tried the handle. Locked. Of course it was. I didn't pick locks. I wasn't a locksmith. My approach was simpler. If it was a normal door, I tried to defeat it without making noise. If it was a reinforced door, I backed off and accepted that it wasn't worth it. This door looked like a normal commercial basement door, sturdy but not a vault. I slid the pry bar into the seam near the latch and put slow pressure on it. No jerking, no sudden pop that would echo. Just a steady bend, letting the metal complain in a low groan instead of a sharp crack. The latch held. I repositioned, tried again, adding a little more pressure and felt something shift. The frame flexed. The door gave me a fraction of an inch. Then the lock cylinder snapped with a soft metallic click. I froze with the pry bar still in place, head tilted, listening hard. Any sound carries in a quiet town like that. If anything was nearby, it would notice. Nothing. I eased the door open 1 inch. The smell that drifted out wasn't rot. It wasn't damp mold. It was old air, stale and dusty, like the inside of a file cabinet that hadn't been opened in 20 years. Paper and concrete and something faintly chemical, like old paint. That was a good sign. I swung the door open enough to slip in, then closed it behind me to keep the light contained. My headlamp stayed off at first. Eyes adjust. Give them a chance. A small window near the ceiling let in a thin gray glow. The basement room was narrow and long, with shelves along one wall and a corridor heading deeper under the building. The shelves held office junk. Binders, broken plastic trays, a dusty printer. But then I saw the second door at the end of the corridor. That door was different. Thicker, painted a sickly institutional green. A wheel handle in the center like something from a ship. And on the wall beside it, another fallout shelter sign less faded, as if it had been protected from sunlight. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just a basement storage room. This was a shelter entrance. I moved down the corridor on the balls of my feet, trying to keep my steps silent. The concrete floor was dusty, and my boots left prints. I hated that. Prints were proof. Proof meant someone could follow. But dust also meant nobody had been down here recently. The green door had a metal placard riveted to it, the kind with stamped letters. Fallout Shelter Area B, maximum occupancy 74. 74 people. In a town this size, that was a chunk of the population. Enough that once upon a time somebody had stood in a meeting room and said, "We can fit 74 down there." Like survival was a seating chart. I turned the wheel handle slowly. It resisted. Old seals. Old grease. I took out a small can of penetrating oil from my pack, something I carried because squeaks and stuck mechanisms could ruin a day. I sprayed a short burst into the wheel hub, waited a few seconds, and tried again. The wheel turned with a low, smooth grind. The dogs released with a soft clunk. I pulled. The door opened inward, heavy but balanced, and the air that rolled out made my throat tighten. Not bad air, just colder, cleaner, like a cellar that had stayed sealed. I stepped through and shut it behind me, then waited with my back against the door, listening. Still nothing. I clicked on my headlamp, keeping the beam pointed low until I had a feel for the room. The shelter corridor was concrete, painted pale gray with a red line running along the floor that led deeper. Pipes overhead. Electrical conduit. On the wall, stenciled arrows pointing toward latrine, med, supply, comm. It was like stepping into a piece of history that had been laminated and forgotten. I followed the red line into a larger room that opened up under the building like the belly of a ship. Rows of metal bunks stacked too high filled the space. Most were bare, but a few had dusty folded blankets still tied with twine. Against one wall were steel shelves loaded with cardboard boxes and metal cans, all stamped with dates and codes. I walked up to the shelves and ran my finger along the top can. The dust came away in a clean streak. Biscuits, survival, the label said. Ah, civil defense. Below that, an expiration date that was basically a joke now. The year was printed in a bold font that made my stomach turn. 1970-something. I had seen these in training materials. Dense crackers meant to keep you alive on paper. People used to store them in schools and municipal buildings. Some had been thrown out years ago. Some got forgotten in closets and basements like this. I didn't trust anything with a label that old, but the fact they were here meant the shelter had never been properly cleaned out, never officially decommissioned the way it was supposed to be. On another shelf were water drums. Blue plastic, 55-gallon style with hand pumps still strapped to them. Nearby, boxes labeled sanitation kits, first aid, Radiac instruments. Radiac instruments meant radiation detection, Geiger counters, dosimeters. It was all straight out of a Cold War manual. And then, on a small table near the center of the room, was a notebook. Not a binder, not a printed manual. A notebook with handwriting. It sat there like someone had put it down carefully and meant to come back. My headlamp beam hovered over it, and I felt the prickle on the back of my neck that always came when I found something too human in an empty place. I didn't touch it immediately. I scanned the room again. No movement, no shapes in corners, no signs of fresh bedding or recently opened cans. But the notebook looked newer than the rest. Not new, exactly, but not 50 years old. I approached the table and saw there were actually 3 items. The notebook, a laminated set of instructions for something called a Carney fallout meter, and a folded map that looked like a USGS topographic sheet. I picked up the notebook carefully, like it might crumble. The cover was black and slightly warped from damp at some point, but the pages were intact. I opened it. The first page had a date written at the top in block letters. March 29, 1979. I knew that date. Anybody in Pennsylvania who paid attention to emergency management knew that date. 3 Mile Island. The partial meltdown near Harrisburg, the panic, the evacuation advisories. People flooded roads. Schools became shelters. Town halls opened basements. I swallowed and flipped the page. The handwriting was neat but tense. The kind of writing you do when you want control over something you can't control. 11:00 a.m. Borough manager says we open Area B key for maintenance. Folks arriving with kids and bags. Some are angry. Some crying. We have 2 volunteers from fire company. Radios work. Food inventory present but outdated. We will log. The next entries described hours passing. People, names, complaints about the smell. A note about the ventilation fan being loud. A note about someone's blood pressure written in a way that made it clear the writer wasn't a doctor but was doing their best. Then, halfway down a page, the tone changed. Door jammed at 15:20, wheel sticks. We got it closed, but it fought us. I told them to keep it unblocked. If this place needs to seal, we can't have anything in front of it. The next page had a list of names and numbers. Families, ages, a count that climbed toward the posted maximum. 74. And then it stopped at 61. I read the next entry and felt my chest tighten. 17:30. Word from Harrisburg is confusing. Some say leave, some say stay. People want answers we don't have. We will wait for official update. The entries ended on March 31st, 1979 with a simple line. Shelter closed. People went home. We left supplies. Maintenance to resecure. I stared at the page. So, someone had opened this place during 3 Mile Island. Used it briefly. Then it had been shut, and apparently nobody had ever come back to clean it out. Except, I flipped forward, and the pages jumped ahead. Different handwriting now. messier, the ink darker. September 19th, 1972. Wait, no. The date went backward. I realized the notebook wasn't started in 1979. It was a shelter log used sporadically and then tucked away, entries scattered when different people wrote in it. There were notes from 1972 about Hurricane Agnes, flooding, and people taking refuge. Notes from the blizzard of 1993. Notes from a chemical spill on a highway in the late 1980s. Every few years, some crisis that made someone remember this place existed. Plans that were supposed to be safety nets, only used when the world got loud. And then I found the most recent entry. The pages near the back looked cleaner, less yellowed. The ink wasn't faded. The date at the top was written with a shaky hand. October 6th. No year. Just October 6th. I did the math without meaning to. The outbreak had started in late September, depending on which version of the story you believed. That lined up. I read the first line and felt the temperature drop inside me even though it was already cold. Got the door open. Didn't think I'd ever use this, but here we are. I sat down on the edge of a bunk without taking my eyes off the page. The handwriting was tight and slanted, like someone writing fast because they were afraid of being interrupted. Town is mostly gone. Some left early. Some stayed, and now we don't go outside unless we have to. I came here because the house is too visible and the generator noise carries. This place is under brick and concrete. If anything is still safe, it's underground. The entry went on to describe supplies, what the writer found, what they moved, what they tried to make work. They left old water drums. Pump seals dry, but I got one working with cooking oil. Vent fan still runs on wall power, but wall power is gone. There's a manual crank for the air system in the secondary room. Loud, only use when needed. There was a sketch of the shelter layout on a page. Bunks, supply shelves. A room labeled "calm" with an old radio table. Then a paragraph that made me pause. I found more than supplies. Found older notes. Found the list from 3 Mile Island. 61 people in here worried about something they could not see, and they went home because the danger passed. That's the difference. Our danger doesn't pass. It waits. I ran a hand over my face. The entry continued. I hear them outside sometimes, even down here. They drift past the basement steps. They bump the building like wind. I keep the door closed and I don't answer anything. It's not people asking. The writer described trying to contact anyone on radios. CB is mostly static. Channel 9 has voices sometimes, but I can't tell if it's real or a loop. I tried the old civil defense handset, nothing. I have a hand crank radio, but it's weak. Then came a list of things they needed. Antibiotics, fuel, batteries, a way to charge. And finally, an entry with a different tone, not just fear. Decision. I am leaving this place. Not because it isn't safe, but because it isn't enough. A shelter is a box. A box works if you can wait for rescue. Nobody is coming. Waiting is a slow way to lose. I'm going to try for the ridge cabin above town. There's a water source and fewer streets. If anyone finds this, take what you need, but don't trust the plan that put you here. Plans are written by people who assume the world keeps working. Under that was a final line, underlined so hard the paper was scored. Do not block the inner door. If you have to seal it, you will not have time. I looked up from the notebook and stared at the green wheel door I'd come through. I hadn't blocked it. I was careful. But the warning wasn't really about boxes and doors. It was about panic. About people turning a shelter into a trap because they tried to make it comfortable instead of functional. About thinking, we're safe now, and letting your guard down until the thing you feared was inside the room with you. I stood and moved deeper into the shelter, following the stenciled arrows toward calm. The communications room was smaller, with a metal desk bolted to the floor and a set of old radios stacked like museum pieces. There was a civil defense transceiver with big knobs, a heavy handset, and a faded chart on the wall listing frequencies. Beside it was a bulletin board with laminated sheets, shelter management, sanitation procedures, radiation monitoring, and, taped crookedly near the bottom, a handwritten note that matched the October handwriting. Battery bank and maintenance closet, 12V. Old but hold some. Use sparingly. Maintenance closet. I went back out and found a door marked Maint. Inside were shelves with tools and spare filters, a hand crank blower assembly, and on the floor under a tarp, 2 deep cycle batteries wired in parallel with a simple fuse block. The setup looked like something a handy person had cobbled together using what was available. The terminals were corroded, but the wires were tight. A cheap voltmeter was taped to the wall. I pressed the button. 11.9 volts. Not great, but not dead. Enough to charge a radio for a while. Enough to run a small light if you were careful. My mind started doing what it always did when it saw systems. It built a plan. This shelter wasn't a fantasy bunker. It was a Cold War basement with aging supplies and limited ventilation. But it was dry. It was hidden. It had a thick inner door that could be sealed. It had water storage that could be cleaned and used. It had bunks. It had a way to charge small electronics for a time. If the town stayed quiet, it could be a staging point. A place to rest without being exposed. But the notebook was right. A shelter is a box. Boxes are good for weather. Boxes are good for hiding. Boxes are not good for building a life unless the world outside comes back. I needed to decide what this place was to me. A home or a tool? I went back to the supply shelves and started opening boxes carefully. I wasn't going to trust ancient food, but the medical supplies were worth looking at. Some items last longer than their printed dates if they've been stored dry and cool. Bandages, alcohol wipes, splints, basic tools. I found a steel cabinet labeled Med. Inside were boxes of gauze rolls, triangular bandages, tape, and small bottles of antiseptic. There were also prescription bottles, empty, probably left by someone during a past event, and, tucked behind them, a small orange plastic case. Inside, a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope. I laughed under my breath, not because it was funny, but because it was so human. Somebody had stocked this place with the idea that you could bring civilization underground in a box, measure blood pressure, keep a log, manage anxiety with procedure. In the corner of the room was a stack of folding chairs with a clipboard on top. The clipboard held a shelter registration form with blank lines for names and addresses. 74 lines. I set it down gently and kept moving. The sanitation area was what you'd expect. Chemical toilets, buckets, lime, instructions. No glamour, but important. There were bags of absorbent material and boxes of plastic liners, dusty but sealed. The water drums had a faint smell when I cracked one lid, stale plastic, but no sign of contamination. Still, I would filter and treat anything I drank. Trust, but verify. Near the far end of the main room was a second green door, smaller, with stenciled text, Air Utility. I remembered the October note about a manual crank system and the warning about noise. I approached the door and rested my hand on it, listening. Nothing. I opened it slowly. The air utility room was narrower and colder, with a concrete floor that dipped slightly toward a drain. Along one wall were ductwork and old blast valves, heavy metal flaps meant to close if there was a shock wave. On another wall was a large hand-crank device mounted to a frame. A Carney air pump, if the laminated sheet nearby was accurate. It looked like a giant hinged box with handles, designed to move air without electricity. There was also a hatch in the floor. That caught my attention immediately. It was a square metal hatch with a recessed handle and bolts around the edge. Not part of a typical fallout shelter layout in a small town, not something you'd need for a simple basement shelter. A utility access maybe, a tunnel, a connection to storm drains, as some old municipal buildings had. I knelt and brushed dust away from the hatch. Someone had disturbed it. There were scrape marks around the bolts, and the dust pattern was wrong, like it had been opened and closed not too long ago. Not today, necessarily, but not decades ago either. My pulse sped up. The October writer had mentioned leaving. They'd mentioned a ridge cabin above town, but they hadn't said how they got out without walking up those basement steps into the open. Maybe this was how. I didn't open the hatch immediately. Instead, I looked around the room for signs of trouble. Droppings, standing water, anything that suggested a bad environment. I checked my gas detector again. Oxygen was fine, no weird readings. I set my pack down, took a deep breath, and began loosening the bolts with a wrench. Each bolt came free with a soft squeal. I paused after every one, listening. It felt ridiculous, being so cautious about noise when the whole world had already fallen apart. But caution was the only thing that had kept me breathing this long. When the last bolt came free, I hooked my fingers into the hatch handle and lifted. It was heavier than I expected. The hatch rose with a suction sound, and a thin breath of colder air wafted up from below. I angled my headlamp down. A ladder descended into darkness. Concrete walls, moisture stains, a narrow utility tunnel leading off in one direction. And, on the wall, just below the hatch, a spray-painted arrow pointing away from the ladder with 3 letters beside it. Out. I sat back on my heels and stared. Someone had been down there, recently enough to still care about marking directions. A forgotten shelter was one thing. A forgotten shelter with an escape route was another. That turned it from a tomb into an option. I climbed down the ladder slowly, testing each rung. The air was cooler and smelled faintly like wet stone. My headlamp beam cut across the tunnel, revealing conduit lines and old pipe runs. The floor was damp in places, but not flooded. The tunnel was just tall enough to crouch walk without scraping my head, and it ran straight for maybe 60 feet before turning. On the wall were more arrows, more spray paint, like breadcrumbs. It felt wrong to follow them, like walking into someone else's plan. But plans were all anyone had now, and ignoring a good one because it wasn't mine was how people ended up stranded. I moved forward, keeping one hand on the wall for balance, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The tunnel turned left, then sloped slightly upward. The construction changed, older brick lining, then back to concrete. At one point, there was a junction with a rusted gate on one side and a collapsed section on the other. The arrows steered me away from the collapse. After maybe 5 minutes of careful movement, I saw light. Not bright daylight, a gray smear filtering through a grate. I approached and found a storm drain outlet built into a low embankment behind a row of backyards. The grate was set into the brickwork and held by bolts. The bolts had fresh tool marks, and the grate itself was slightly bent, as if someone had forced it open and then pulled it shut again from the outside. I crouched and looked through. Behind the drain outlet was a narrow strip of woods, and beyond that, a view of the hillside climbing up behind town. I could see rooftops through bare branches. The position was hidden from the main street. You could slip out here and move uphill without being seen by anything wandering downtown. A good route, a smart route. The October writer wasn't just hiding, they were thinking. I backed away from the grate and sat in the damp tunnel for a moment, letting the reality of the shelter settle in my mind. This place had been built for a crisis that never happened the way people feared. It had been used in small ways during storms and scares. Then it had been forgotten. Then, in the worst crisis of all, someone had found it and tried to use it, leaving behind warnings and a path. A chain of human decisions stretching across decades, all pointing toward the same basic truth. People prepare, and then they improvise, and then they hope. And hope is not a plan. I climbed back up to the utility room, closed the hatch, and tightened the bolts enough to secure it without making it permanent. I wasn't going to trap myself in here, not ever. I left the wrench beside it as a quiet promise to myself. If you need to move fast, you don't want to hunt for tools. Back in the main shelter room, I sat at the table and flipped through the notebook again, slower this time. The older entries weren't just history, they were proof of how shelters were used. People came in scared, expecting someone to tell them what to do. The shelter managers tried to impose order with sign-in sheets and rules. Then, when the immediate threat passed, people left because the outside world still existed and still mattered. But now, the outside world didn't behave like that. Now, threats didn't pass in an afternoon. That meant the shelter's original purpose was upside down. It wasn't a place to wait. It was a place to regroup, to reset, to plan the next move. I looked around the bunks again and tried to imagine 61 people crammed in here in 1979. Kids crying, adults whispering, the air thick with fear and sweat. Someone trying to keep a log like writing it down could keep it from becoming real. Then I imagined 74 people down here now, in this world, with no all clear coming. It would be chaos, it would be loud, and loud would bring trouble. A shelter wasn't just concrete, it was behavior. It was discipline. It was understanding that comfort could get you hurt. That was why I stayed alone. Not because I didn't want people, because people under pressure become a noise problem. I stood, shouldered my pack, and started selecting what I could use without draining the place. I took medical tape, gauze, a few small bottles of antiseptic, and a box of nitrile gloves. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, an old one, but it might be a backup if I could find batteries that fit. I took the laminated shelter layout sheet and folded it carefully into my jacket. Then I paused in front of the survival biscuits again. Out of curiosity, more than need, I opened one tin. The lid came off with a reluctant hiss. Inside were dense, pale blocks wrapped in wax paper. They smelled like cardboard and old grain. I broke a corner off and tasted it. It was edible, in the same way drywall might be edible if you were desperate. It didn't taste rotten, just stale and dry. Food is food, though, especially if it's sealed and you're counting days. I wrapped the tin back up and took it anyway, marking the lid with a piece of tape, emergency only, a reminder to myself not to start snacking on it just because it was there. Before I left, I added my own line to the notebook. Not a long confession, not a speech, just facts. December 25th, Caleb M. Found shelter intact, utility tunnel exit confirmed. Battery bank at 11.9V. Took basic med supplies and 1 tin biscuits. Inner door functional. Do not block, do not make noise. This place is a tool, not a home. I paused, pen hovering, and then added one more sentence because it felt wrong not to. If you came here expecting rescue, you are already behind. I set the pen down and closed the notebook. The walk back out felt different. The shelter wasn't just a lucky find. It was a responsibility now. A fixed point on my personal map. a place I could return to when the roads got too dangerous or the weather turned brutal, but also a place that could become dangerous if I got careless. I shut the green wheel door behind me and turned the handle until it locked, then listened again with my ear against the cold metal. No sound. I moved through the basement corridor and paused at the outer door, checking my mirror and peeking through the seam for any shadows that weren't there before. The street outside still looked empty. The wind still moved leaves like it was the only thing alive. I stepped out, closed the door softly, and climbed the steps. The town was still quiet, but quiet is a trick quiet can break. As I crossed the back lot behind the old savings loan, I saw something that made me stop again. Footprints. Not mine. Not the sharp tread of boots like mine. These were lighter, smaller, and they cut across the dust behind a shed and disappeared around the corner. Fresh enough that the wind hadn't softened the edges. I stood still, eyes scanning, and felt the old instinct rise up. You are not alone. I backed into the shadow of a garage and waited, listening. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, a sound like scraping, somewhere down the alley. Not a quick shuffle, not the crisp step of someone walking with purpose, more like a slow drag. I tightened my grip on the strap of my pack and moved my rifle into a ready position without pointing it yet. I didn't want to broadcast fear with a barrel. Fear makes you twitchy. Twitchy makes you loud. The scraping sound grew closer, then stopped. I waited. A shape drifted into view at the far end of the alley. A person, moving slowly, head tilted, arms loose at their sides. Their clothes were dirty and oversized, like they'd lost weight. Their movements were uneven, not like someone scanning for danger, more like someone following a faint thread of attention. The infected. I had seen enough to recognize the pattern. They weren't sprinting, not yet. This one was in that drifting state where they wandered and bumped into things like sleepwalkers, reacting more to noise and motion than anything else. It had probably heard something when I opened doors, or smelled me, or maybe it was just wandering. I held my position and didn't challenge it. The alley was narrow, but I had distance. If I backed away now, quietly, it might drift past without ever focusing. Then a second shape appeared behind it. And a third. They weren't in a tight group, but they were close enough that if one got curious, the others would follow. My mind flashed to the notebook line. They bump the building like wind. Down in the shelter, safe behind brick and concrete, you could still hear them if they were close enough. The shelter wasn't invisible. It was just hard to access. If a small cluster started lingering around the basement steps, it would become a problem. I backed away, slow, keeping my body angled so I could move while still watching them. My boots found the softer ground behind the garage, where the dirt would swallow sound better than pavement. I slid along the fence line toward the street without stepping into the open. The first infected drifted closer, head turning slightly as if it had noticed a change in the air. It took a few uneven steps, then stopped, swaying. I froze. A long moment passed. The infected's head dipped. It turned away again and continued down the alley, dragging its feet, bumping a trash can lightly with its hip. The can rocked but didn't fall. The others followed, slow and dumb. I let out a breath through my nose and kept moving, not letting relief make me careless. When I reached the main street, I stayed close to the buildings, using doorways and window frames for cover. I could have gone straight to my truck, but I didn't. I didn't want to lead anything toward it. Vehicles were too valuable. If something lingered near your vehicle, you might lose the ability to leave. Instead, I looped around, circling wider, checking for more movement. I saw no one else. No living faces in windows. No smoke from chimneys. Just the town's shell, waiting. At the edge of the burrow, I reached my truck and slipped into the driver's seat without slamming the door. I sat still, hands on the wheel, and looked back toward the direction of the shelter. This was the moment where a person in a different world might feel triumph. A lucky find, a secret bunker, a hidden advantage. What I felt instead was something heavier. Because the shelter wasn't really mine. It belonged to every person who had written in that notebook, every volunteer who had unlocked it during a storm, every frightened family that had sat on those bunks for a few hours and then gone home. It belonged to the October writer, too, the unknown person who had tried to turn it into a safe pause button and then realized there was no pause anymore. And now it belonged to me, not as ownership, but as obligation. If I used it wrong, if I got sloppy and drew trouble to it, I would be the reason it failed the next person. Survival plans always fail the people who trust them most. That thought wasn't philosophical, it was mechanical. If you trust a plan, you stop watching for what the plan didn't account for. You assume the door will open. You assume the air will last. You assume the crowd will behave. You assume someone will come. Assumptions were expensive now. I started the engine and let it idle, watching the street ahead. The gas gauge was just under half. Enough to get back to my own hideout if I didn't waste it. I didn't gun it. I didn't peel out. I rolled away like a normal person leaving a normal town on a normal day. On the way out, I took the back road that climbed into the hills, the one that ran parallel to the old rail line. From there, I could see the rooftops of lichens through the bare trees. The town tucked into its valley like it was trying to hide from the sky. I thought about the ridge cabin the October writer mentioned. Above town. Water source, fewer streets. There were plenty of cabins and hunting shacks scattered in those hills. Some were owned by families that used them on weekends. Some were forgotten. Some were likely occupied now by whoever made it out early. I didn't have time that day to go searching, not if I wanted to get back before dark. But the notebook had planted a seed. A shelter below town, a cabin above it. 2 points, 2 options. If I was smart, I'd connect them. Make a route, make caches. Make it so no single place was my whole plan. Because the worst thing you can do in this world is fall in love with one safe spot. That's how people end up defending a box like it's a destiny, even when the box was never meant to hold a life. By the time I reached my own base, a small, reinforced maintenance garage outside another town, I had already started organizing the shelter in my head like a project. What it needed, what it could realistically support, how to use it without drawing attention, how to keep it from becoming a trap. That night, I cleaned and inventoried what I'd taken, then sat by a small battery lantern and opened my map book. I found lichens and traced the roads. I marked the shelter building location as precisely as I could without writing "shelter" in big letters like an invitation. I marked the storm drain exit behind the backyards. I marked the ridgeline above town and circled likely cabin areas. Then I stared at the map and felt something that I hadn't felt in a while. Not hope, clarity. The shelter was a lesson buried under brick. History doesn't save you, but it teaches you. People before you tried to prepare. They tried to write rules and draw arrows and stock supplies and make a plan for fear. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Now, in the quiet after everything broke, their leftover plan had become part of mine, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And real is what keeps you alive. I closed the map book and turned off the lantern, listening to the night beyond the garage walls. Somewhere far off, there were faint sounds. Wind, a distant knock, the world moving in slow, uneasy ways. I thought about the notebook line again. Waiting is a slow way to lose. I wasn't going to wait. Not in a basement, not on a ridge, not anywhere. I was going to build a network of small, practical advantages, and I was going to move when moving made sense. I was going to treat every shelter as a tool and every plan as temporary. Because the people who trusted plans the most were the ones who got surprised when the plan stopped working. And surprise is the one thing I couldn't afford. If you'd asked me before all this what an emergency shelter really was, I might have said, a place to keep people safe. Now I knew better. An emergency shelter is a mirror. It shows you what you thought would happen. It shows you how you expected the world to behave. It shows you what you believed about rescue. And if you're honest, it shows you the part that always fails, the part where you assume somebody else is in control. There wasn't anybody in control anymore. Just people making choices, leaving notes, drawing arrows, and hoping the next person was careful enough to read them. I was careful. And I was going back to that shelter soon, quietly, on a day when the wind was right, with a better filter for the water drums, a few fresh batteries, and a plan to check the ridge above town. Not because I wanted to live underground. Because the shelter under that small town wasn't the end of a story. It was a hinge. A place where the past had left me a tool, and the present demanded I use it without trusting it. And if I could do that, if I could learn from every plan that failed and every note that warned, then maybe I wouldn't end up as a line in someone else's notebook. Just another entry, just another person who thought concrete and rules could hold back the world. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.